happens when an entire continent decides to lock its doors overnight. On November 7, 2025, millions of Russians woke up to find Europe had vanished not geographically, but politically. Flights were canceled, visa centers went dark, borders turned from gateways to walls. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, panic rippled through airports as travelers realized the Schengen gates had been slammed shut. It was the day the European Union quietly revived an iron curtain, this time built not of barbed wire, but of bureaucracy. The European Commission's decision to suspend all multiple entry visas for Russian citizens indefinitely marked a geopolitical earthquake. According to Reuters and BBC Europe, the measure was the culmination of months of rising tensions, drone incursions, and suspected sabotage inside EU territory. For years, Vladimir Putin's hybrid tactics, cyber warfare, espionage, and energy blackmail sought to destabilize Europe from within, but the Kremlin's invisible war just met a visible response. The move shattered a silent understanding that had defined post-Cold War relations. For 3 decades, Russians could live between two worlds, earning in Moscow, spending in Nice, studying in London. That bridge, as DW noted, symbolized the illusion of coexistence between authoritarian power and Western privilege. The Schengen visa was more than a travel document. It was a passport to modernity, a psychological escape hatch from Russia's tightening grip. Now that hatch has been sealed shut. Strategically, the EU's decision was more than symbolic punishment. It was a countermeasure in a hybrid war, a retaliatory strike designed to fracture the Kremlin's social and economic elite from within. As The Guardian reported, the timing was deliberate. Only weeks earlier, Russian drones had harassed NATO's F-35 bases in Denmark and Norway. The message from Brussels was unmistakable: cross our skies, and we'll close your world. It was diplomacy with surgical precision, targeting not tanks or missiles, but the jet-set class that sustained Putin's system. Yet the implications stretched far beyond Moscow's mansions. In Kaliningrad, thousands of families suddenly found themselves trapped between two closed borders, Poland and Lithuania. In St. Petersburg, students lost access to European universities overnight. Across Russia, a generation accustomed to crossing freely into Europe found itself caged inside what many now call Putin's open-air prison. Al Jazeera described the shock as both emotional and existential. The Europe they grew up visiting, one analyst said, no longer exists for them. Globally, the echoes were immediate. The Ukraine war had redrawn Europe's map of trust, but this was something new, a bureaucratic blockade as potent as any tank division. In the Middle East, Israel's confrontation with Iran's proxies mirrored the same struggle: how to isolate an aggressor without igniting a wider war. In Asia, Trump's US-China containment strategy, economic restrictions, visa screenings, and tech sanctions revealed a similar pattern: borders becoming weapon security, overtaking freedom. The world's arteries were closing one policy at a time. The paradox is clear. Europe says it defends freedom by restricting movement. Russia claims to defend sovereignty by suppressing dissent. Somewhere between those two justifications, millions of ordinary people are caught separated from families, futures, and the illusion of choice. For many, the Iron Curtain never truly disappeared. It merely changed shape. If the past taught that walls can fall, can new ones rise faster than we can break them? And as borders tighten from Brussels to Beijing, how long before liberty itself becomes the next casualty of this silent war? The war no longer rages with tanks, but with paperwork. Across Moscow, endless queues formed outside European visa centers, only to be met by locked doors and silence. Inside the Russian elites, private circles, panic replaced privilege. Overnight, the continent that once welcomed them had vanished. Europe had not just closed its borders, it had erased an entire class of travelers: the Russian elite, the educated, the mobile. What began as a diplomatic sanction turned into a bureaucratic siege. According to BBC Europe and Reuters, the EU's decision transformed visa applications into interrogations. Enhanced security screenings meant that every Russian, from IT engineers to university professors, would be examined like a potential spy. Rejection rates exceeded 90%. What was once a routine process had become a ritual of humiliation. As DW noted, even the wealthiest Muscovites with spotless records were being treated as national security risks. Europe is not a playground, said Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas. Travel is a privilege, not a right. But beneath the headlines lies a deeper strategy. The EU didn't just aim to punish the Kremlin, it sought to dismantle the soft foundations of Putin's internal power. For years, Moscow's elite tolerated political repression because their comfort came from the West villas in Italy, bank accounts in Spain, schools in Switzerland. Now those lifelines have been cut. The Guardian reports that Russian billionaires are stranded, their yachts impounded, their properties frozen, their children's schooling suspended. The implicit contract Putin once offered, stay loyal and your lifestyle will remain untouched, has been broken. The effects are already visible. The first wave of economic tremors hit Russia's service and tech sectors. Defense news confirmed that defense-related suppliers could no longer coordinate with European firms, cutting off access to critical machinery and software. Even industries unrelated to the war, pharmaceuticals, aviation, and energy logistics are feeling the pressure. With travel bans, conferences, and trade fairs off limits, Russian business people have lost their remaining windows into global commerce. The isolation once imposed on North Korea now looms over Moscow's economy, slow, invisible, and suffocating. The Kremlin's reaction predictably was defiance. State media called it a Western hysteria, a continuation of Cold War Russophobia. Yet even Kremlin insiders admit the blow was devastating. They've locked us inside, one anonymous oligarch told Al Jazeera. Our money can't move, our children can't study, and our people can't leave. What began as an external sanction has turned inward, transforming Russia's own wealth into dead weight. Strategically, Europe's decision mirrors the same doctrine Washington now applies to Beijing. Under President Trump's renewed containment strategy, Chinese executives face travel restrictions and export bans similar to those imposed on Russia. Both aim to fracture power by targeting the elite's comfort, not the regime's weapons. It's a war fought through isolation, not invasion. And just like sanctions against Iran's Revolutionary Guard or Hezbollah's networks, these policies inflict slow but deep wounds, cutting arteries rather than striking the heart. The human cost, however, is unambiguous. Millions of Russian families are separated across borders. In Kaliningrad, the enclave once described as Russia's window to Europe, ordinary people now live in a geographic trap. Air travel is prohibitively expensive and land crossings remain sealed. Students who dreamed of studying abroad now face a dead end. A generation raised on the promise of globalization suddenly finds itself confined to a fortress state. For Europe, this is more than policy, it's philosophy, a belief that peace must now be protected through walls, not openness. But can freedom survive when borders become weapons? And as Europe builds its digital and physical fortresses, is it protecting its citizens or imprisoning its ideals? It began with whispers in the Baltic Sea, drones appearing over NATO airbases, ships moving in silence, and radar blips that shouldn't have existed. By September 2025, what Europe once dismissed as paranoia had become undeniable. Danish intelligence traced the mysterious UAVs circling Copenhagen's F-35 hangars to Russia's Shadow Fleet covert ships disguised as civilian vessels. The discovery jolted Brussels. Putin had brought the war to Europe's skies, and Europe this time struck back not with missiles, but with bureaucracy sharper than any blade. Reuters and The Guardian described the EU's November 7th visa suspension as a strategic retaliation, the invisible counterattack to months of Russian hybrid aggression. Moscow's game-blending espionage, sabotage, and digital warfare had turned Europe's open borders into vulnerabilities. Yet by closing them, the EU flipped the playbook. What Putin built as a war without front lines had found one drawn across airport terminals and embassy counters. The timeline reads like a chessboard collapsing in slow motion. March 2025. Europol issues a classified report warning of Russian operatives infiltrating organized crime networks to sabotage EU logistics routes. June, explosions target railway hubs, moving arms to Ukraine. September, 3 Russian MiG-31s breach Estonian airspace for 12 minutes, testing NATO's response time. Every move drew Europe closer to its breaking point. As DW reported, each drone flight, each incursion was not just a violation, it was a rehearsal. But this hybrid warfare meant to intimidate backfired spectacularly. Instead of dividing the West, it unified it. Under Trump's leadership, NATO accelerated intelligence coordination. American ISR drones began patrolling the Baltic daily, relaying live data to Brussels and Warsaw. Defense news confirmed that NATO's Baltic air policing mission doubled its intercepts after the September incident. Europe is learning deterrence again, one senior US official told Reuters. Putin forced the continent to remember the Cold War and rebuild it. Meanwhile, Moscow's hybrid strategy began devouring itself. Each act of sabotage justified another Western restriction. Every drone flight led to another sanction. The Kremlin's goal to make Europe afraid instead made it resolute. In Germany, France, and the Netherlands, public opinion shifted sharply. What began as war fatigue became a demand for containment. The more Russia probed, the more walls went up. Globally, the pattern was unmistakable. The Ukraine conflict had already redrawn Europe's security architecture. Now similar doctrines were emerging elsewhere. In the Middle East, Israel responded to Iranian drone attacks with strikes on proxy bases in Syria, mirroring NATO's Defend Forward model. In Asia, the US-China confrontation grew colder after Beijing's AI espionage scandal. Washington imposed travel bans on key Chinese scientists, citing security reciprocity. Across continents, borders were being militarized, not with barbed wire, but with algorithms, screenings, and sanctions. For ordinary Russians, the hybrid war they never chose is closing in from both sides. The West no longer sees them as tourists, but as potential threats. Inside Russia, surveillance tightens under the banner of national security. The paradox of power is complete. The Kremlin's global offensives have turned inward, trapping its own citizens in isolation it once sought to export. And yet a haunting question remains in countering shadow wars with bureaucratic fortresses. Has Europe preserved peace, or simply prolonged the silence before the next storm? The barbed wire may be gone, but Europe's walls have never been higher. From the icy borders of Finland to the forests of Poland, the continent has transformed into a fortress, a blend of physical barriers, digital surveillance, and political unity not seen since the Cold War. The turning point came quietly. After the September 2025 Zapad military exercises, Poland refused to reopen the Brest and Kozlovice border crossings with Belarus. It was the first sign that Europe's patience had run out. The crossings were more than checkpoints. They were arteries connecting Russia to the EU. Now they are closed indefinitely, symbols of a new age of containment. As Reuters reported, Poland's decision was swiftly mirrored by the Baltic states and Finland. Each frontier became a line of defense reinforced with motion sensors, drones, and NATO surveillance grids. European airspace, once open to thousands of civilian flights from Moscow and St. Petersburg, turned into a monitored no-fly zone. DW called it a bureaucratic Berlin Wall, invisible, but just as impassable. Within months, the dream of a borderless Europe had evolved into a continent-wide security doctrine fortress Europe. Behind this doctrine lies a fundamental shift, a recognition that hybrid warfare demands hybrid defenses. Intelligence sharing platforms between NATO and the EU have merged into real-time coordination hubs. Defense News confirmed the installation of US-supplied radar networks in Estonia and Lithuania, integrating American ISR technology directly into Europe's defense web. The result, a 24-hour watchtower system stretching from the Arctic to the Black Sea. The era of naivete is over, declared a Finnish general to The Guardian. Every sky, every cable, every port must now be treated as a battlefield. The doctrine's economic and political logic is equally striking. Europe, guided by Trump's insistence on reciprocal security, has embraced the American model of deterrence peace through preparedness. The EU's budget for hybrid defense has doubled, targeting cyber attacks, energy blackmail, and information warfare. In Brussels, bureaucrats talk less about unity and more about resilience. It is a language of walls and vigilance, not ideals. BBC Europe noted that in 2025 alone, 27 attempted sabotage operations linked to Russian networks were disrupted across Poland, Germany, and the Czech Republic, proof they say that the system works. But at what cost? Fortress Europe protects its citizens, yet slowly strangles its openness. For many Europeans, freedom of movement, once the soul of the Union, is fading under layers of visas, vetting, and suspicion. Refugee routes from the Middle East have been further restricted, justified by counterintelligence concerns. Inside airports, random screenings target not only Russians, but anyone with dual cultural exposure. The same Europe that once preached globalization now speaks the language of security clearance. Globally, the echo is unmistakable. In Ukraine, trenches and anti-drone defenses mirror the EU's psychological fortifications. In Israel, border technologies designed to intercept rockets now inspire European border agencies. And in Washington, Trump's security advisors hail Europe's shift as proof that the West finally understands survival. It is, they argue, a model for defending civilization in an age of asymmetric threats. Yet for ordinary citizens, Russian or European, this fortress feels less like protection and more like confinement. The fear of infiltration has reshaped the continent's identity. The walls may keep danger out, but they also lock empathy in. Al Jazeera captured the sentiment in one haunting line: Europe is safe, but it no longer feels free. Is this the price of security, to become what you once opposed? And when every door is locked, who decides which freedoms are worth keeping? In the shadows of Europe's southern frontier lies the story few dared to tell, the back door that almost reopened the continent to Moscow. Serbia, long walking the tightrope between east and west, became the Kremlin's hidden corridor. Officially, Belgrade stayed neutral. Unofficially, it turned into Russia's silent accomplice. After 2022, Serbia deepened intelligence cooperation with Moscow under security exchange agreements. By 2025, that relationship had matured into something far darker: a passport pipeline for Russian elites and operatives escaping Western sanctions. As Reuters and The Guardian revealed, hundreds of Russian businessmen, intelligence officers, and sanctioned oligarchs quietly obtained Serbian citizenship. On paper, they were investors or humanitarian donors. In reality, they were architects of espionage, carrying new Serbian passports that granted visa-free entry into the Schengen zone. It was, as DW called it, a Trojan horse strategy, legal, invisible, and lethal. Through Belgrade, Putin's networks could re-enter Europe under the disguise of legitimacy. Europol had warned of this long before. Its March 2025 intelligence brief, later cited by Al Jazeera, detailed how Russian operatives were embedding within Balkan financial systems to launder money, finance sabotage, and coordinate cyber intrusions. Some of the names traced in that report were linked to nuclear weapons contractors and defense exporters under heavy sanctions. When Brussels finally moved on November 7th to suspend all multiple entry visas for Russian citizens, it wasn't just retaliation, it was containment. The EU's message to Serbia was blunt: cut ties with Moscow's networks or risk losing your own access to Europe. Belgrade suddenly found itself cornered. On one side, Russian energy and capital still flowed through its veins. On the other, EU integration, Serbia's long-term dream, was now hostage to its silence. BBC Europe reported that Brussels began re-evaluating visa-free travel for Serbian citizens, signaling that the privilege could vanish if Russian infiltration persists. For the first time, Belgrade was forced to choose not between East and West, but between secrecy and survival. Behind the political theater, European intelligence agencies worked methodically. Defense News confirmed that between 2023 and 2025, Europol, MI6, and Polish counterintelligence dismantled multiple Russian espionage networks stretching from London to Warsaw. In December 2023, a 14-member cell was convicted in Poland for plotting to derail arms shipments to Ukraine. In May 2025, 6 Bulgarian agents operating under Moscow's orders were sentenced in London for espionage. Their operations forged documents, encrypted payments. Deepfake identities were traced back to the same Balkan intermediaries facilitating Serbian passports. Each arrest exposed another layer of the Kremlin's hybrid empire. What began as a diplomatic gesture issuing citizenship to allies became the Achilles heel of Europe's security. The EU's response was surgical. Enhanced screening now cross-references biometric data, travel histories, and financial transactions between Schengen states and Balkan databases. As DW reported, dual nationals with links to Russia face near automatic denial. The age of innocence is over, said a Europol director. Citizenship no longer guarantees trust. Strategically, this battle extends far beyond the Balkans. The same infiltration model, mixing legal loopholes, corruption, and identity laundering, mirrors tactics used by Iran's Quds Force and China's United Front networks. Whether in Serbia or Hong Kong, the pattern is clear: war no longer needs soldiers to cross borders. It only needs paperwork. And Europe, once a symbol of mobility, now stands as the world's most guarded maze. Yet behind the geopolitics lies a quieter tragedy: ordinary Serbians caught between two empires. Belgrade's youth, desperate for European futures, now fear collective punishment. "We are paying for someone else's war," one student told Al Jazeera. And perhaps in a way, Europe is too learning that even freedom needs fences. How long can a continent build higher walls without losing sight of the humanity it seeks to defend? The echo of locked gates now defines a nation. In Moscow's airports, the once glittering departure halls stand half-empty screens, flickering with canceled flights to Paris, Berlin, and Rome. What began as a bureaucratic freeze has evolved into a psychological siege. For the first time since the fall of the Soviet Union, Russians feel truly cut off from the world, not by ideology, but by isolation. The collapse of the European bridge is no longer political theater, it is daily life. Inside the Kremlin, the mood has shifted from arrogance to anxiety. Putin's advisors, according to Reuters, warned that the EU's visa ban has shattered the last illusion of normalcy. The elite, once immune to sanctions, are furious. Villas in Tuscany now sit vacant, private accounts in Zurich frozen, their children stranded abroad. The social contract that kept them loyal wealth in exchange for silence has disintegrated. One former diplomat told The Guardian, they'll forgive him for war. They won't forgive him for grounding their jets. Economically, the blockade's effects multiply by the week. DW notes a reverse migration from Georgia, Armenia, and Serbia as Russian professionals discover they can no longer move onward to Europe. Talent is trapped, capital is frozen, and technology transfers have collapsed. Factories depending on European parts have shut down. Even Russia's defense industry, already stretched by the Ukraine front, now struggles to import precision tools from Germany and Italy. The arteries of commerce, wrote Defense News, have been surgically severed. What sanctions began the visa ban has completed. Globally, the repercussions are rippling outward. Trump's Washington hails the move as proof that Western deterrence works. NATO leaders see in Brussels' resolve a blueprint for the future pressure without war containment, without occupation. In contrast, Beijing watches with alarm, fearing similar isolation should tensions over Taiwan escalate. Meanwhile, Iran's leadership, facing its own embargoes, praises Moscow's resistance to Western tyranny. The world is dividing once again, not into blocks of ideology, but of access, who may move trade and connect, and who must remain behind walls. Yet beneath the strategies and slogans, the human toll deepens. Families across Russia are separated from loved ones in Europe. Mothers can no longer visit their sons studying in Germany. Children cannot attend funerals in Estonia. Airfares skyrocket. Sea routes through neutral ports are packed with desperate travelers. Al Jazeera called it a silent humanitarian fracture, the pain of isolation measured not in casualties, but in goodbyes left unsaid. What was meant to punish the Kremlin has instead imprisoned the people. Inside Russia, propaganda reframes the crisis as Western cruelty, but even state media cannot mask the despair. Social networks overflow with images of empty consulates, denied passports, and stranded tourists. For many Russians, this marks the end of an era, the final collapse of post-Soviet integration. Europe is gone, wrote one Moscow blogger, and we are the ghosts left behind. Strategically, Putin has achieved what no adversary could have done for him, transforming his own country into a pariah state. The once open bridges to Europe are rubble, and the Kremlin's circle grows ever smaller. Trump's America, leveraging sanctions and intelligence sharing, has orchestrated a containment unseen since the Reagan era. The map of power has shifted not through war, but through isolation. The question now is whether these walls can contain the chaos they've created. Can Europe remain safe when its neighbor turns desperate? Can freedom survive when every act of defense feels like a new restriction? And as the world divides between fortress and exile, who will history remember, the builders of walls or those trapped behind them? Europe's decision to seal itself off from Russia has reshaped the geopolitical landscape of 2025. What began as a visa suspension evolved into a new kind of warfare, one fought through isolation instead of invasion. By cutting access to Europe, Brussels delivered a blow that neither sanctions nor diplomacy could achieve. It fractured Putin's inner circle, paralyzed Russia's economy, and turned privilege into punishment. Yet this fortress strategy carries its own costs, the slow erosion of the very freedoms it claims to defend. Under President Trump's renewed Western doctrine, the EU and NATO now operate as a single security bloc, confronting hybrid threats with bureaucratic walls and digital borders. From the Baltic to the Balkans, Europe stands watchful, resilient, but no longer open. Russia, trapped between defiance and decay, drifts into pariah status. The dream of integration is gone. The age of closed doors has begun. And as borders harden from Moscow to Beijing, one question haunts the global order. When every nation learns to build walls faster than it can build trust, what future remains for peace itself?